There may be no word in modern Christian culture that has done more financial damage than the word content. It is quoted casually, preached confidently, and rarely examined carefully. Many believers have been taught that to desire growth is dangerous, that ambition is suspicious, and that financial progress somehow contradicts faith. All of this is often justified with a single biblical command: be content. Yet the same Bible that calls believers to contentment also commands multiplication, stewardship, dominion, preparation, and inheritance. Scripture praises those who plan, build, save, invest, and think generationally. This creates an apparent contradiction, one that has confused millions of believers and quietly shaped Christian financial behavior for decades. The result is not humility but stagnation, not peace but passivity, not faith but fear dressed up as spirituality. This video argues that biblical contentment has been profoundly misunderstood, and that this misunderstanding has kept countless Christians financially stuck, not because God desires poverty, but because Scripture has been misapplied. Properly understood, contentment does not oppose growth. It protects the heart while growth happens. When contentment is confused with complacency, believers abandon stewardship, reject structure, and spiritualize financial neglect. Understanding what the Bible actually means by contentment is essential, not just for personal peace, but for faithful obedience, effective stewardship, and long-term legacy. So how did contentment become a tool for stagnation? Well, contentment is often taught in modern Christianity as the opposite of desire. Believers are encouraged to suppress ambition, mute financial goals, and settle for enough, lest they appear worldly or greedy. The most frequently cited text is Philippians 4:11-12, where the Apostle Paul writes, "I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances." On the surface, this sounds like a call to acceptance of limitation. However, when removed from its historical and literary context, the verse becomes a blunt instrument used to discourage progress. Evidence of this misuse is visible in everyday Christian life. Believers remain in the same financial condition for decades while claiming peace. Parents fail to plan financially for their children's future, calling it trusting God. Churches avoid teaching on money systems, ownership, or stewardship beyond basic generosity, framing financial education as unnecessary or even dangerous. The analysis reveals a consistent pattern. Contentment is taught as inactivity. Yet Scripture never equates peace with passivity. Paul's instruction was not addressed to people refusing to grow, but to a man fully engaged in mission, responsibility, and expansion. This misunderstanding is extremely important. When contentment is redefined as do not pursue growth, believers abandon biblical stewardship and confuse spiritual maturity with financial immobility. What did Paul actually mean by contentment? Well, to understand biblical contentment, one must examine Paul's life, not merely his words. Paul wrote Philippians while imprisoned, yet even in chains, he was organizing churches, mentoring leaders, and managing resources for kingdom expansion. His contentment was not circumstantial limitation, but emotional independence. Paul explicitly states that he had experienced both lack and abundance. This detail matters. Contentment was not learned in poverty alone, but also in prosperity. The Greek word, often translated as content, implies sufficiency, inner stability, and freedom from anxiety, not an absence of desire or responsibility. Other writings further support this interpretation. In 1 Timothy 6, Paul warns against the love of money, not money itself. He instructs wealthy believers not to discard wealth, but to steward it properly and be rich in good works. The evidence shows that Paul never discouraged growth. He discouraged identity dependence on external circumstances. His contentment allowed him to build without fear and suffer without despair. Why does complacency feel spiritual but isn't biblical? Complacency often masquerades as holiness because it feels safe. It avoids risk, responsibility, and exposure. By contrast, growth requires learning, action, discipline, and accountability, all of which confront fear. Scripture, however, consistently commands movement. Genesis opens with the mandate to be fruitful and multiply. Jesus praises servants who increase what was entrusted to them and rebukes the one who preserved resources out of fear. The wisdom literature repeatedly honors planning, diligence, and foresight. Despite this, complacency is often celebrated culturally within Christian circles. Believers who struggle humbly are praised, while those who build systems or pursue ownership are viewed suspiciously. Yet nowhere does Scripture glorify sustained lack. Poverty is depicted as a condition to be alleviated, not preserved. The analysis reveals that complacency feels spiritual because it reduces responsibility. But biblical faith always carries responsibility. Stewardship is not optional, it is expected. This further connects to the premise, misinterpreting contentment as complacency creates a false spirituality that protects fear instead of faith and excuses neglect instead of obedience. What is the financial and generational cost of misreading contentment? Well, the long-term consequences of this misinterpretation are severe. Financially, believers fail to develop margin, ownership, or systems that create stability. Emergencies become crises. Opportunities become threats. Dependency replaces freedom. Generationally, the damage compounds. Proverbs teaches that a righteous person leaves an inheritance to children's children. Yet when parents spiritualize stagnation, children inherit confusion instead of preparation. Evidence of this can be seen in the widespread loss of family wealth within 2 generations, not due to immorality, but due to lack of structure. Assets without instruction disappear. Money without stewardship evaporates. The analysis underscores a hard truth. Good intentions do not overcome poor interpretation of Scripture. When contentment is misunderstood, believers reject planning and discipline, then wonder why provision feels fragile. What does true biblical contentment actually look like? Well, biblical contentment is not the absence of desire, it is the presence of peace. It allows believers to pursue growth without obsession and steward resources without anxiety. True contentment produces gratitude, not stagnation. It allows a believer to say, "I am thankful now, and I am still building." It creates stability of identity so that financial fluctuation does not determine worth. Scripture presents numerous models of this balance. Joseph prepared Egypt financially while trusting God fully. Proverbs praises both satisfaction and diligence. Jesus himself rebuked worry, not preparation. The evidence is clear. Contentment is an internal posture, not an external ceiling. This proves that when correctly understood, contentment frees Christians to pursue biblical stewardship, growth, and legacy without guilt or fear. Therefore, being content was never meant to keep Christians poor. It was meant to keep their hearts anchored while their obedience expanded. This video has shown that modern Christianity often misinterprets contentment as a call to stagnation, when Scripture presents it as emotional independence from circumstances. Paul's teaching, far from discouraging growth, empowered fearless stewardship. Complacency, though comfortable, is not biblical, and the cost of misunderstanding contentment is paid not only in finances, but in generational readiness and obedience. The Bible does not call believers to settle, it calls them to steward. Contentment was never permission to stop building. It was a safeguard to ensure that growth does not corrupt faith. I'll leave this final thought with you. God did not call his people to be content with less obedience, only with less anxiety. When peace and progress walk together, biblical wealth, faithful stewardship, and lasting legacy become possible. Thanks for tuning in, and subscribe for more teachings on faith, money, stewardship, systems, and legacy.